Dear colleagues, respective audience, we think that it's a nice time to continue our work, our conference, and let me open the second panel, which will be dealing with human rights issues, human rights protection, and also, again, we'll deal with humanitarian diplomacy also. This is a key topic for today's conference. And I have a big pleasure to give the floor to one of the best professors of our institute, to Professor Natalia Yakovenko, who is teaching actually diplomacy and the role of diplomacy in international relations in our institute. And she will be presenting a topic, religious factor in international relations. Professor Yakovenko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be invited here and to speak to our audience, and I say our students, maybe they do know me already, but you introduced me nicely. Thank you very much. I'll try to be short, of course. I'll try to be brief because I have much material to speak on the problem, but to tell the truth, it's not my subject of research, really this very religious problem. Nevertheless, it is connected with every subject, I think, with all topics, and it is really important and topical nowadays. I'd like to begin stressing that in the context of increasing tension in the modern world, the return of the factor of religion to international relations became apparent. One cannot help accepting Huntington's thesis on the growing role of religions in the 21st century. I hope everybody knows Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and read this book. And nevertheless, Huntington wrote more about civilizations, where religion is only one of many determining factors. The very fact that religious ideals and confessional institutions have often remained beyond the bounds of international research can find an explanation for the existence of certain tradition of a positivist and highly empirical methodological approach, which is typical for the 1970s. As a result, the so-called religious factor was simply ignored as an active element of international relations, and the only exception to the idea seems to be Islamic fundamentalism. But it seems to me that even lots of people who are not historians are well aware of religiously based wars in world history. Religion caused a number of human deaths, including human sacrifice. We all know a lot of facts concerning it. We will not speak much about those terrible things. We know about crusades, about bonfires, about Inquisition, but we will not concentrate our attention at this. And we know much about it, and names of Giordano Bruno and Jeanne of Arc and others and other well-known victims and are famous. But, you know, I'd like to remind one more fact about religion which changed the world, a religious fact which changed the world absolutely, and it is my topic of research at last. Britain. Do you remember Henry VIII? Because I address students, not remember from the books, I mean, from your studies, how he cut off his church from Rome. And since then, Anglican Church was introduced, and up till now, Anglican religion exists and plays a very important role in the life, or in the life not only of Britain, but at that time it really changed the continent of Europe. If you read history, I am sure you know much about it, but it is only one bright example which will demonstrate you how religion can radically change international situations. And our topic, religious factor in international relations. Well, religious movements today are becoming an increasingly important factor in international life. These are Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Muslim, Buddhist organizations that actively participate in attempts to prevent and resolve armed conflicts, or at least try to alleviate the suffering of the people involved in hostilities. Members of these organizations often become participants of the peacekeeping force or act independently. At the first section of our conference, we were speaking much about it, and representatives of different units like these expressed their ideas and provided much information on it. The conflict of civilizations that Huntington also wrote about is no longer a miracle in which one can believe or not believe. Religion is actually the driving force of dozens of conflicts in the modern world, according to estimates by conflict scientists who determined the causes of 101 armed conflicts in the world from 1989 to 1996. Only 6 of them were interstate. All the others were inter-regional collisions where the religious or ethnic factor played a very important or even crucial role. Nevertheless, let me go on. Violence and discrimination against religious groups by governments and rival faiths have reached new heights in all regions of the world, except Americas, maybe, according to the report by the Pew Research Center. I also hope very much that you know about this the research center. Social hostility, such as attacks on minority faiths or pressure to conform to certain norms, was strong in 1/3 of the 198 countries and territories in 2012, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. Religious-related terrorism and sectarian violence occurred in 1/5 of those countries in that year, while states imposed legal limits on worship, preaching, or religious were in almost 30% of them. Pew said. It is according to Pew Research Center. Nevertheless, we have also another evidence. Would you please have a look at this diagram? It is Encyclopedia of Wars by Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod. You know, religion causes war. We mentioned some religious wars of the past history. I mean, historical facts. But would you please have a look at this diagram, and you will see that only 7% were caused by of wars were religiously motivated, for which casualty estimates about for less than 2% of all people ever killed in warfare. But you know, it's also rather this source is I think also at the same time it is subjective, because while writing a book or while writing a research, there's a certain author, and he has or she has his or her approach to it, and how classify whether the war was religious or not religious. And that's why you can find different data and different descriptions of war, because they are classified. This was classified maybe using different methods. But nevertheless, this source exists, and you see only 7% of all historic wars are considered by these authors as primarily religious. 54% of them involved Islam. We will speak about it a little bit later, but in general, the religious philosophy of the 21st century in the 21st century world, through the prism of belonging to the main religious directions, had the following characteristics. Christians 2.1 million, Muslim 1.3 million, 900 million Indians, 900 million Indians, 394 million other branches of Chinese groups of national religions, 376 million Buddhists, and so on. But you know, look at the religious landscape of the world. It better demonstrates the general religious picture of our planet. But I'd like to mention here as well that 1.1 billion people consider themselves to be atheists, to have no religion. But it's an idea. Such an idea exists that atheism is also a religion, a kind of religion. It is a debatable problem, of course. According to Pew Research Center, again, I mentioned this center, Christianity remains the largest religion in the world. With you're tired of the figures, I think. But very interesting and important conclusion I'd like to stress, conclusion of the Pew Research Center, that by 2050, the number of Christians will grow at a slower pace. By 2050, the Pew Research Center predicts virtually the establishment of parity between Muslims and Christians. 2.8 billion people, 2.9 billion people, so the figure will be about the same. By 2050. Well, we'll live to 2050, of course, and we will see whether the researchers are right or not. Then the Buddhist population is expected to be fairly stable due to the low birth rate and aging population in countries such as China, Thailand, and Japan. Worldwide, the Hindu population is projected to increase by 34%, from just over 1 billion to almost 1.4 billion. Roughly, the number of Jews, the smallest religious group, will grow by 16%, from 14 million in 2010 to 16.1 million worldwide in 2050. And there are too many figures, but I think you can realize a general picture, a general description of the project, of the expectations concerning the number of believers and supporters of that kind of religion. This one. Globalization. We have such a phenomenon nowadays as globalization, and the same concerns religion. Globalization of religion does not remove the demarcation lines, but strengthen them. Therefore, it is high time for development of a system of international religious security in the context of the transformation of post-bipolar international relations and the evolution of the contemporary world order. So you see, religious security is one more point which became a contemporary popular one. Now, everybody knows about terrorism, at least heard about it, because it's the most popular topic which is widely discussed in TV programs, or in radio broadcasts, and so on. I'd like to say, to stress that terrorism is a result of conflicts, and mainly contemporary conflicts are ethnically based, and every ethnic conflict is more or less caused by the religious factor. And as a result, terrorism is one of the elements of this reason and of these conflicts. It is, of course, an important threat to world security. Experts talk about the era of religious terrorism. A well-known scholar of religious conflicts, David Rappaport, argues that modern terrorism is evolving wave-likely, and each wave covers about a generation. You may have a look at the screen and see that this scholar distinguishes three waves of terrorism. The first wave is the anarchy, and it began about 1880s, and it was followed by the anti-colonial wave of 1920s, and it lasted about 4 years. Then the third wave, the left-handed, began in 1960 and was awaiting the end of the 2000s. And at last, a religious wave began in 1979, and according to David Rappaport, it will continue until the mid-20s of this century. Well, very soon it will come to its end. And then I'd like also to stress that religious terror is distinct from secular terrorism and is markedly different. Secularists prefer to kill high officials. Religious terrorists seek acts with a maximum number of victims. Secularists are inclined to reduce the number of civilian casualties to the minimum necessary to maintain their own organization. Religious terrorists prefer the maximum number of victims. Human life for them, including the life of companions, means nothing. Secular terrorists attack symbolic objects, while for religious terrorists not only symbolism but also the number of victims is important. And you know, this differentiation is presented by one of the well-known scholars, Viktor Jelensky, who, you know, wrote many papers on the topic. If you are interested, I am addressing the students, you may get acquainted with his publications. Well, the question is humanity doomed to wait nearly 2 decades for the natural extinction of the wave of religious terror? Can religious leaders not accelerate its decline? You know, this question is not new, of course, and even Friedrich Engels, who was very popular in the Soviet Union as a Marxist founder, once he noted that the era of terror cannot be equated with the domination of people who initiate harm. On the contrary, it is the domination of the people who are most mortally frightened. Terror is more of a cruelty, which is carried out for self-comfort by people who are horrified themselves. Obviously, the great world spiritual traditions, which in their essence are the golden rule of universal ethics, can prove to be most effective in healing this terrible disease. Then, you know, this we will have a look at the interrelationship of religion and international sphere, because it is this very topic, religious factor in international relations, we are studying now. And so all the diversity of interrelationship of religion and the international sphere could be reduced to several main directions. You can see these 3 directions on the screen. First, it's an indirect influence on social and moral foundations, installations, so-called, under the influence of which the foreign policy of the states is formed, its character is determined, and political and economic interests are taken into account. Second, it is a direct participation in international activities of religious as well as secular structures. Example, churches on the one hand, and on the other parties of religious orientation. And thirdly, it's a manifestation through an individual, a supporter of a particular religion, who himself directly participates in the events of his country and abroad, reacts to them, forcing the leadership to reckon with his outlook. A religious factor actively influences interstate relations due to several objective circumstances. Well, yes, the question is how does it appear and how does it act? First, of course, the phenomenon of globalization, which we have already mentioned today, the consequences of which are mass labor and political migration, marriage of people with representatives of different nationalities, confessions and states. And now you see the figure, up to 10% of the inhabitants of industrially developed countries of Europe were born beyond their borders, including Ukrainians, of course. Export-import interstate disputes, the formation of transnational cooperation, etc. The consequence of such comprehensive economic, political, social, cultural changes is the final completion of the era mono-ethnic, mono-ideological, mono-religious societies. Then the phenomenon of active development of transnational religious networks, religious organizations. These networks spread throughout the world through the opening of their national affiliates. And it can also, and it is explained by the methods of their management and organization inherent in economic transnational corporations. This was made possible by the process of religious globalization, which, according to scientists, is an active participant in the process of human globalization. It is the main point made that they are, of course, they are not only closely connected, but they are inseparable. This globalization, the meaning of which we all know very well, and this religious globalization, also a globalization, but they are together. Another reason for the rather strong manifestation of the religious factor you know, I missed one, also, I also want to,
up to you, up to you.
the so-called, I want also to mention the phenomenon of so-called glocalization. Glocalization, it is the interaction and synthesis of global ideas which are spreading through globalization with local ideas and cultural traditions together, global and local. And as a result, we have globalization. New religious organizations are rapidly expanding in these regions, and it is including Ukraine. They declare themselves not only as a religious, but also political institutions. And now at last this one more reason. It is the rather strong manifestation of the religious factor in international politics is the presence of effective international organizations in the religious orientation of the supporters, most of which are well established and in some cases with extensive foreign policy experience. And first of all, it is Catholicism. It's one of the most widely spread religions in the world. And Catholicism has a single world center, the Vatican or the Holy See, the state with 130 foreign missions. Vatican carries out extensive interstate ties and is the subject of international law, concludes treaties and agreements with other states, both bilateral and multilateral ones. Lots of parties or political organizations whose programs are oriented on religious foundations become a powerful instrument of influence on international relations. International associations of religious forces, for example, World Council of Churches, which includes more than 300 Protestant and Orthodox churches, including the Russian Orthodox Church. They also play a prominent role in the field of contemporary international politics. Increasingly, the clergy are gaining influence. For example, it should be also remembered that religion is being self-reformed under the influence of external circumstances, and at the same time, it itself transforms them and affects them. I want, to be sure to do my presentation shorter because I see that you are tired. And while analyzing the problem, it's also important to consider the interconnection between religious and ethno-national factors. It was mentioned already. There's an interesting feature here. The greatest influence on real life and politics is not isolated religious or national factors, namely the cohesion or symbiosis. Interaction and mutual influence of national and religious factors cause an increase in the influence on public consciousness. At the same time, we should not forget about the role of traditions. If in the economy, politics, management system, the tradition can evolve quite quickly, then in the sphere of consciousness, the elements of stability, strengths of tradition are most strongly traced. For centuries, ethnic and religious ideas have remained unchanged, stable, facing not only the change of the political regime, but also the social system as a whole. Together with modern forms of church life, the rebirth of previously forms of religious rituals, ceremonies can be observed, which are formed and apprehended as a return to the roots, mass pilgrimage, spread of mystic groupings and seminars, a rise of popularity of miraculous icons, and so on. And at the same time, it should be mentioned that trends to changes are not limited to updating. The real role of religious organizations depends on a number of circumstances: stability, historical traditions, integration into social culture, the state of a particular denomination, the particularities of interconfessional relations in the state and the region, the ethnic composition of the population, and so on, etc. At the present stage, we can observe the growth of the role of religious factor in international relations. This is due to the increasing importance of cultural factors in shaping world politics through the emergence of a certain ideological vacuum after the crisis of communism. If during the Cold War the world was divided into ideological groups, the post-bipolar era solves the problem of identification, taking into account other important values, the historical past, religion, language, belonging to a particular cultural group, nation, and civilization. The more religion is ignored, undermined, or misplaced in the study of world affairs, the lesser we are nearing a solution to the political problems of the world. And, I'd like to, I am going to conclude, and you may ask, of course, students, first of all, whether it is bad or not, that the religious, good, that the religious factor is increasing, its influence is increasing in international relations. It is a debatable question, of course, a debatable problem, and we can discuss it for a long time. But I'd like to say it is my opinion that there are no bad religions, and no religion teaches you to do bad things. It exists. It exists. Every religion exists to improve a human being, to avoid hostilities, to teach people how to live in peace and harmony with the outside world. And that's why it seems to me that it's not so bad. It's not bad at all. I remember, the world, the period period of socialism or communism or Marxism, how we call it was a society without a religion. Formally, the church existed, and it was not forbidden at all, but in fact, it was. And we all were Komsomol members and communists, and and it was forbidden for a communist or a Komsomol member to attend the church. And only just, very limited number of churches existed in large cities. I'm from Dnipropetrovsk, for example, and only one small church existed in the center of the city. And from time to time, people try to have a look. Entered, but they tried to, it was better to avoid it, such a step, because you could be watched, and according to Marxist ideology, you couldn't attend the church if you are a real patriot, a real Komsomol member, a real communist, and that's why it was, but I'm sure that the world, even the communist world, with those faraway, remote terrors of the Stalinist terrors, it would have been much wiser and better and more human if the communists had not destroyed religion in the time of this October revolt, October Revolution of 1917. The picture could have been quite different. And now, of course, I'll show you several pictures to illustrate how religious factor is really being demonstrated, and how representatives of religion cooperate with diplomats, including Ukrainian diplomats and so on. These certain results. Of course, we cannot avoid mentioning our eastern territories occupied by another state, but please, some examples are given here. This, for example, this year, this Volodymyr Groisman, in Turkey, he met with Bartholomew, the patriarch, in Istanbul, and there were also several political leaders, as you see, and they discussed the problems of the day, the topical problems of political life, and this communication, the prime minister and the head of the church, of one branches of Christianity. Then you see the father and the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, His Beatitude Sviatoslav, during the informal reception in Kiev organized by the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations, welcomed the newly appointed first extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador of Australia to Ukraine. And up till now, up till recently, we did not have any embassy of Australia here. And to get the visa to go to Australia, Australian visa, you should visit Moscow, first of all. Even London, you are experienced in this, I know you did. But now we do have, and you say the cooperation with, and this is the prayer, by the way, prayers for the state, for this or that state, for peace, for the peace in the country, for coming out, for overcoming crisis, for better life of a certain state. They are becoming more and more popular among politicians and diplomats. Prayers. You see here our ambassador Oleg Shamshuk in France praying for Ukraine in the church, Ukrainian church in Metz. It is a city in France. And then the ambassador of Ukraine to Australia. Australia is popular and becoming more popular with every passing day. Mykola Kulenic. Many people in the hall know Dr. Mykola Kulenic, and they discussed, you see, Metropolitan and Antony discussed the ways of cooperation between the diplomatic representation of Ukraine and the church, especially the role of local parish communities in preservation of Ukrainian Christian and ethnic traditions, culture and language. Moreover, a significant portion of the conversation took place around the issue of divided Ukrainian Orthodox Orthodox ecclesiastical body and the need for unity among the various jurisdictions of Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so on. And here, unfortunately occupied. Donbass, unfortunately occupied. Economics, you know, this is a study which is called Occupied Donbass Economics, Demography, Impact Group Strategies for Ukraine. And it is conducted by the Center for the Study of Russian Research. And Delovaya Stolitsa edition it is. And you may look through what they read. But you see also the church, according to the study, the priests bless the fighters of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics for combat feats with the approval and hierarchs and so on. And those hierarchs have become part of the ideological propaganda machine of the occupation regime. So you see political life and church life and religious factors are inseparable. You know, they are the single unit they are becoming. The same, you know, the same Russian Kirill, Patriarch Kirill made a mention of Ukraine. The speech of the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church could not boast any originality as it reproduced all the same theses which were repeatedly voiced. For nearly 4 years, the fullness of the Russian Orthodox Church has raised prayers to the Almighty's throne for elimination of the bloody division on the territory of Ukraine, and so on, and Onufri and clergymen and all faithful children of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church really need intensive prayers. And Vatican's ambassador in Ukraine, you know, his idea is not new and is not so much original, and it was, you know, it was pronounced, expressed here. The church is the only place where such a dialogue is possible if the conflict reach stalemate, and the churches may often perform a different role, becoming a platform for the parties to the conflict who see no other reason to start a dialogue. That means that the church can be a mediator between the sides of a conflict, between all the sides, and it is really the place. And here, this original dominance of religion in Ukraine, you know, I say that I am speaking to for a long time, and we have other speakers who with their presentation and look at the different kinds of religion which exist in Ukraine, in different regions of Ukraine, and it is the percentage of religions in Ukraine. I could not avoid Ukraine because, you know, we are here, and we cannot omit mentioning our state and our religious situation. Thank you very much. I'd like to, I think that it is high time for me to stop. God bless you all.
Thank you, Professor Yakovenko, for this interesting and I would say remarkable presentation. Yeah, some just notices. Yes, it's a good thing that we now have the Australian Embassy in Ukraine, but unfortunately it was established not because of good things, but because of MH17 catastrophe. So sometimes these diplomatic issues are risen because of such events. And of course, the situation in Ukraine is important. And I think that for our students, one of the most important notices from the Professor Yakovenko's presentation is that there is no a single bad religion. We know that unfortunately in mass media there are some, let's say, journalists that give criticism to some religions, though it's not true. There are some movements inside some religions which can be dangerous, but not the religion itself. So thank you, Professor Yakovenko, for a very interesting presentation. And now let me give the floor, please, to another professor from our institute, but also a representative of Ukrainian Association of International Law, All Ukrainian Association, which collects all the professors and researchers in the sphere of international law. Professor Dr. Olga Butkevich, who is one of the leading Ukrainian specialists and experts in international law, who is one of the leading specialists in history of international law, in public international law, in human rights protection, with a presentation on effects of armed conflicts on international obligations of the states in the domain of human rights.
Thank you very much, but also Ukrainian Association of International Law also covers not only professors and researchers and academics, but practical lawyers as well, and state representatives of state service as well. Thank you very much, and my topic does not relate directly to religions, but it relates to human rights. And world religions were the first mechanisms to guarantee and to protect human rights. Now Russian aggression against Ukraine has revealed general trends in present-day international law which aims at minimizing the impact of armed conflicts on the continuity of treaty obligations in general and treaty obligations in the domain of human rights in particular. The classical concept of the effects of war upon treaties has passed through three subsequent stages. At first, the war was regarded as an event that should terminate the operation of international agreements. This approach was influenced by the natural law doctrine. The second stage in the development of this concept started at the end of 19th century and at the beginnings of 20th century. It was marked by more practically oriented and pragmatic approach and by the influence of positivism. The general view was that international treaties should continue to operate except in cases of essential influences of hostilities on their implementation, or they may be suspended for the wartime. The third stage in the development of this concept began with the prohibition of war by the UN Charter. Afterwards, it was also influenced by the process of globalization at the beginning of our century and the shift in understanding of war as legal means of restoration of justice to illegal action or even crime defined the attitude to the effects of war on treaties and contacts. Indeed, war does not stop international relations. Sometimes it even activates them, becoming a mighty catalyst of new era or new period of international law. The same was with the end of 30 Years' War, which ended with the conclusion of Peace of Westphalia, which terminated, this peace terminated 30 Years' War and introduced new historical period of international law, of so-called classical international law. The same is true about rapid development of international law after the World War II. Today, as judge of the ICJ, considered to date has mentioned, jus ad bellum is transforming into jus contra bellum. But that is too optimistic because another international lawyer, Stefan Neff, has pointed out that after 1945, what was really witnessed after 1945 was less the abolition of war than its reconceptualization. Due to these changes, armed conflict today cannot be regarded anymore as a ground for non-compliance with international obligations of the states. Today we are witnessing the transformation of international legal conception of war. It manifests itself in the prohibition of aggressive war and transformation from the very idea of just war to the concept of armed conflict. This may be noticed even in terminology. Nowadays, most international legal instruments do not use the term war, but armed conflict instead. Also, in the present day situation, we are witnessing the appearance of the new phenomenon of hybrid war, and I will stop on this phenomenon later on. Unfortunately, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties has not solved the problem of an effect of armed conflicts on treaty obligations. In 1985, an attempt was made to codify this issue in the resolution of the Institute of International Law called The Effects of Armed Conflicts on Treaties. The above resolution influenced the work of the UN International Law Commission of the draft articles on the effects of armed conflicts on treaties. This work was finalized in 2011, and this document includes the following provision, that is the provision of Article 3. The existence of an armed conflict does not ipso facto terminate or suspend the operation of international agreements. Also, it should be borne in mind that a legal fact of the beginning of an armed conflict entails entry into operation of international treaties concluded for the event of armed conflict, for the event of war. Such treaties or such instruments as Geneva Conventions on the protection of war victims and their additional protocols, and also other agreements on international humanitarian law, international law of armed conflict, and first of all and foremost, international protection of human rights. In the current international law, the following consequences of armed conflict may be identified. First, some international agreements are completely terminated. First of all, these are agreements in the fields of security, military cooperation, political treaties on friendship and cooperation. Second, international treaties on protection of human rights, as well as treaties in the field of environmental protection, which is rather present, rather current new trend in international law, they cannot be terminated on the ground, on the just ground of armed conflict. Third, armed conflict does not affect treaties founding documents of international organizations and treaties on the status of borders. And the last one, hostilities may initiate the conclusion of special humanitarian treaties. First of all, treaties in the field of human rights and in the field of international humanitarian law. And now we should mention the special status of international obligations in the domain of human rights protection in the current international law. It can be shown on the example of reservation to such agreements and on the example of state succession. International obligations in the domain of human rights have a rather specific status as to the reservations, and this is true about them. According to the so-called Strasbourg approach, that is the position, the idea of the European Court of Human Rights and former European Commission on Human Rights, according to their position, reservations to the treaties on human rights are generally not desirable, and they are acceptable only to some technical issues. This is so-called severability doctrine. And the UN Human Rights Committee, and now it is called Council, has the same approach as the European Court of Human Rights has. International agreements on human rights are of this special character. Another important issue is the issue of the continuity of the commitments in the domain of human rights, and there is a presumption which was repeatedly emphasized by the UN Human Rights Committee and UN Human Rights Council, according to which in the course of the state succession, human rights obligations should remain valid for the successor state. And that very approach was stated in the decision of the ICJ in the case of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. And let me quote this position of the ICJ. A principle of the modern international law has been formed due to which there is an automatic succession to the vital intrinsic human rights, such as prohibition of genocide. This case was connected with the prohibition of genocide. The problem occurs when the armed or other conflict makes it impossible to the state to comply fully with its international obligations in the field of human rights. We may recall rather famous Martin's Clause, which relates to the basic inherent human rights. Other rights, such as right to property and some other right enshrined, for example, in the Article 15 of the European Convention on Human Rights, they are more they have more dispositive nature, and they may be the subject of this so-called evolutionary approach, and they may be derogated from. And also, let me touch the topic of the effect of the Russian aggression against Ukraine on the obligation in the domain of human rights. A rather large range of problems results from the fact that a state permanent member of the UN Security Council has committed direct aggression against another state, thereby blocking peacekeeping activity of this body. Russian-Ukrainian conflict is characterized as a hybrid war, which appears to be a recent phenomenon. Such phenomenon relates to many fields of international and also municipal life. This kind of conflict covers different domains of human and not only state activity. Also, violation by Russian Federation of erga omnes rules, such as prohibition of aggression, due to domino principle entails grave violations against the whole complex of current international legal order. Therefore, it is not possible to separate legal sequences and sequences for human rights from violation of the Budapest Memorandum or the Helsinki Final Act or the UN Declaration on the Principles of International Law or the UN Charter or the European Convention on Human Rights. All these documents and commitments in the domain on human rights protection are interconnected, especially in the domain of protection of human rights. A very important step was made by Ukraine in this respect, in the respect of impossibility to comply to some obligations in the domain on human rights protection. On 21st May 2015, the Parliament of Ukraine approved the resolution by which adopted the Declaration on Derogation from the certain obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. According to this document, due to the annexation and temporary occupation by the Russian Federation of the integral part of Ukraine, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, as a result of armed aggression against Ukraine, the Russian Federation is fully responsible for respect of human rights and implementation of the relevant treaties in annexed and temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. The same approach was repeated in a number of resolutions of the Council of Europe, of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Committee of Ministers of this organization, as well as that was stated in the resolution of the General Assembly as to the occupation of the Crimea. Both international treaties, I mean International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and European Convention on Human Rights, envisage derogation from some of their provisions in cases of war or armed conflict, better to say. The declaration is made under Article 15 of the European Convention and Article 4 of the International Covenant. Further, both the Secretary General of the Council of Europe and the Secretary General of the UN had been notified by the government of Ukraine of its decision to derogate from these obligations. Due to Ukrainian analysts, due to representatives of the Ukrainian Association of International Law, also let me quote their position, due to them, in fact, we are talking about an even greater level of responsibility that rests on Ukraine. After all, declaring about the derogation, Ukraine gave the right to the Council of Europe and the United Nations to monitor the implementation of their restrictions. In addition, a state that derogates from individual obligations has an additional obligations to provide information regarding the fulfillment of its international obligations relating to the protection of human rights. Also, human rights activists and representatives from NGO consider the statement of Verkhovna Rada, I mean this act of derogation, as an absolutely logical step, since it was issued due to the lack of physical access to the territory occupied by the Russian Federation. And Ukraine cannot guarantee or protect human rights in the respective territories. This case is an example of how an armed conflict affects unilateral obligations of the state under international treaty. Human rights also covers another dimension of conflict, of armed conflict, so-called use post-bellum or post-conflict regulation, post-conflict settlement. In this respect, there may be identified several domains of post-conflict settlement that consist of different issues which are interrelated, and all of them include human rights dimension. These are four main ways or four main parts of post-conflict settlement. These are security, human rights, economics, and criminal prosecution. Each of them has different domains and different fields of implementation. And in each part contains human rights dimension as well. And I would not like to take your attention for a rather long time, so let me go to the final remarks. And here I would like to stress on just several aspects. Ukraine now, after the aggression of Russian Federation and temporary occupation of the part of Ukrainian territory, Ukraine should appeal to international judicial bodies and claim from the Russian Federation responsibility for the violation of its human rights obligations and demand appropriate reparations for those affected by this occupation and aggression. The occupation of Crimea and armed conflict in the east of Ukraine have revealed general trends in international law as to the effect of armed conflict on the international obligations of the states in the domain of human rights. The latter shows the formation of mechanisms aimed at minimizing the impact of the conflict on the continuity of such commitments and such obligations. This reflects the lawlessness of war and aggression in present-day international law and increased role of global community. And this conflict and this situation shows us that probably it shows us the loss of the former decisive role of the state, especially in international human rights law. The place of states, the role of state is replaced by global community, by international community and global universal civil society, which is even more effective in settlement of such conflicts. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Butkevich, for this international legal perspective regarding the issues of protection of human rights. And now, since we are running out of time, but still all our presentations are very important and I think necessary for us, it's a big pleasure to give the floor to our colleague from Poland, to Professor Renata Duda from Institute of International Studies from University of Wrocław, whose topic is very interesting, and I think very interesting to look at a, let's say, country study perspective of how the transformation of religiosity in the Polish society happened and what's now currently happening there. So, Professor Duda, please, the floor is yours.
So, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to that conference. It's a great honor for me to be here and to share with you some reflections about Polish religiosity. My topic, as you see, my topic is slightly different from the speeches you've already listened to, but let's say this is the so-called diversification. So in my speech, I would like to present the result of the research concerning the religiosity of Poles conducted by the Public Opinion Research Center in July 2017. So there are a lot, there are the latest data. And on this basis, I'm trying to show the role of the religion in everyday life of Poles. It should be stressed that Poland is a country in which religion is still plays a significant role in social, both in social and family life, and it is closely connected with the fact that almost 94% of Poles admit to Catholicism and feel closely related to the tradition and faith, even if they do not practice regularly. For the survey, the research center used two basic indicators, asking people for faith and religious practices. And generally speaking, Polish religiosity is exceptional comparing with the other European nations. The declared faith is almost universal, and over half of adults residents of Poland admit that they at least weekly participate in religious service. So going further to the details presented in the survey, as far as faith, based on the self-declarations of Poles defining their approach to faith and to religious practices, we can say that the commonly declared faith in God is rather a permanent feature of Polish society, because systematically conducted research shows that from the end of 90s, more than 90% of respondents, this rate hesitates from 92% to 97%, consider themselves as believers, so this is huge amount. Approximately every 10th evaluates their faith as deep, and the percentage of people who belong to rather or totally unbelievers remain relatively low for years, from 3% to 8%. And after 2005, this is a very important date in Poland, especially when it comes to survey of the religiosity, because it is the year of the death of John Paul II. So we can see, after 2005, we can see a slight increase in the percentage of people describing themselves as non-believers, and decline in the declaration of deep faith. And as far as Poles' involvement in religious practices, which in years 1997-2005 remained fairly stable, after 2005 began to significantly weaken. We can say that in the last years there is a slight trend away from regular practice toward occasional or non-participation in religious service. In years 2005 and 2014, the percentage of respondents who have been practicing regularly at least once a week decreased from 58% to 50%, while the number of respondents going to church not more often than once or twice a month rose from 33% to 37%, and the number of people never attending service rose from 9% to 14%. And from the combination of the declaration of faith and religious practices shows that from 2005 to 2012, the percentage of believers who regularly attend service decreased from 58% to 50%, and at the same time there was a slight increase in the number of believers who practice irregularly, from 32% to 35%. Non-believers and practitioners, honestly, I don't know how it is possible. So non-believers and practitioners from 1% to 2%, and non-believers and non-practicing from 3% to 6%. And another indicator of religiosity is the frequency of praying. Approximately 66% people pray at least once a week. These results consist of people who pray several times a day, 6%, daily or almost daily, 35%, and at least once a week, 26%. With less frequency means less than once a week, but more often than once a year. Pray a little over 21% of people. And one a year or even less, this form of practice is used by just over 5% of people, and less than 8% does not pray at all. So this pure quantitative data shows that the level of Polish religiosity is quite high, but the picture becomes less clear when the results of in-depth research are analyzed. As I mentioned, only 50% of those 94% of believers practice regularly, but we can say that contrary to the announcement of the so-called secularization after the fall of communism, will automatically, this number is rather stable, and since 2008 has remained unchanged. But however, qualitative research reveals the weaknesses of Catholicism in Poland. For many believers, it is a selective and syncretic faith, and among the respondents, only half accept the integral teaching of the Church. The others admit that they believe in the so-called their own way, and sociologists define these attitudes as church-fight and privatized-fight. Sorry, terrible word. But it is characteristic that people who consider themselves as strong Catholic deepen their faith, become Catholics of choice, and consciously identify themselves with the Church. They sometimes depart from the traditional model of religiosity, but their commitment to the life of parish increases. The number of such deep believers in the last 20 years from 1993 to 2014 doubled from 4 to 8%. So this increased involvement proves that the Church becomes a space performing not only a sacral function, but it is also a place for building ties, creating educational and cultural activities. The other activity of Polish Catholic is pilgrimage to sanctuaries. So pilgrimage to sanctuaries are very popular among Polish Catholics. Over 7 million Poles go to over 500 sanctuaries located around the country every year. The phenomenon is that pilgrims are people regardless of their education, age, or social status. Poles also often go to sanctuaries located abroad, mostly to Rome, Lourdes, Holy Land. In total, 15% of Poles goes to holy places. Polish pilgrims constitute over 20% of Christians in Europe and 5% in the world. So it is a huge amount. And the last thing, a new form of religiosity, which is very interesting. We can say that the current model of the so-called folk religiosity is disappearing, but many other phenomena arise, which is the sign of the new type of manifestation of faith that we can describe as metropolitan faith. These new initiatives combine traditional forms of faith with contemporary ones. The believers gather thanks to media, especially social media. Example, since 2009, during Easter holiday, the March of Three Kings have been organized in Poland. And in 2016, this event took place in 420 cities and towns, as well as abroad, where Poles live. So summarizing this data shows that we can even risk the thesis that the thesis about the slow secularization of Poland, but of Poles, but the Catholic Church is still powerful, at least at the level of declaration of the faith. Over the past decade, however, fundamental changes in quality has taken place. We can even talk about the kind of revolution. While in 2005, 65% of Poles who declared themselves as believers simultaneously declare that they use the church's indications in everyday life. Today, only 40% say so. From 32 to 52% has increased the number of those who say that they believe in their own way. So we can say that the fight clearly become more private and more individual, and the pace of these changes, we can say that it is quite fast. So actually that's all what I would like to talk about. This is only the pure data, I didn't comment that, so thank you very much for the opportunity, for the possibility to present the result of the survey conducted. I would like to stress that because it is not my own research, so conducted by the Public Opinion Research Center in Poland. So thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Duda, for these interesting facts, interesting figures. And really, it looks like Poland is one of the countries who still religious factor is very important, and we think that this is a good thing for morality of the Polish society. And dear colleagues, before finishing our conference, if you don't mind, I would take maybe not more than 5 minutes to talk about the issue of protection of human rights under international humanitarian law, because this term several times arose today here, either by Mr. Ashliman or by Professor Butkevich. So just to clarify some issues and just to give the notion of why it is important to talk about protection of human rights under international humanitarian law, and why it is of great importance for Ukraine today to talk about these issues. So as a big part of this audience knows, that international humanitarian law or jus in bello, or law of armed conflicts, is the international law which applies during the armed conflict. So when the armed conflict is in, international humanitarian law is an additional mechanism, additional to international human rights law, which helps human rights law to protect human rights and freedoms and dignity during the armed conflict. In this way, international humanitarian law, or how it is called, for instance, in Britain, in the USA, law of armed conflicts, is called by International Court of Justice lex specialis, a special legal regime which is additional to international human rights law. And this classic formula was set 20 years ago in 1996 in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the case on legality of use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. And still, this is very important to understand that when we have the armed conflict, we have not only European Convention of Human Rights, and not only European Court of Human Rights, and not only International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but we also have international human rights law with famous Geneva Conventions, with famous additional protocols thereto, which also apply in this case. Actually, international humanitarian law is two concepts in one. First notion and first idea of international humanitarian law is to protect human rights and freedoms, to protect those victims who became harmful during the hostilities. And the second idea is that international humanitarian law regulates the use of means and methods of warfare, which means that international humanitarian law stresses which weapons can be used and which ways of conduct can be used during the hostilities. For Ukraine nowadays, international humanitarian law is of big importance because we have two situations. One is qualified as an occupation in Crimea. The second for sure is qualified as an armed conflict in Donbass. This is a very important issue probably for state officials to understand that the issue that we don't have the war legally pronounced. We don't have martial law enacted. We have this legal status of anti-terrorist operation. For the application of international humanitarian law, this means nothing. For the application of international humanitarian law, the main issue is the issue of the matter of fact, whether the armed conflict is in, whether the occupation is in. We have all these issues, and that is why international humanitarian law is very important, and Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian law enforcement agencies shall and must apply IHL. International humanitarian law protects human rights in addition to international human rights law, and a very important issue is that international human rights law, for instance, famous European Convention on Human Rights or International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they protect people because we are humans. We have two hands, two legs, one head. We're all the same. International humanitarian law defends human rights and freedoms based on the category approach. It needs to specify to which category does the person belong to, and only after that, international humanitarian law will say which rights and freedoms does this particular person have. That is why, for instance, there can be a person who is a civilian or a prisoner of war who has a lot of rights and freedoms under IHL, and there are some categories like, for instance, mercenaries who have only basic rights, for instance, humane treatment and right to a fair trial, and this is it. So this is very important to understand, again, for Ukrainian authorities, that in order to understand who has which rights, we need to clarify the category to which this person belongs, because again, IHL protects wounded, sick, shipwrecked, prisoners of war, civilians. It has special regime of protection in relation to women, pregnant women, children. And that is why we lawyers who specialize in international law, on all the conferences, roundtables, or just meetings with Ukrainian authorities, we make the notion, we speak about the importance of the application of international humanitarian law in Ukraine, both in Crimea and in Donbass. Nowadays, the last thing for me to say now in this issue is that people who are not so acquainted with IHL may look at the report on preliminary examination activities of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of 2016, where very briefly the International Criminal Court in The Hague states why IHL is applicable to the situation in Ukraine and what does he think on this issue. And again, very important for us to understand what is the approach of the international legal institutions and bodies. Today, the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court is being opened in New York, in the United Nations headquarters. It will last till the 14th of December. And on the 8th of December, the prosecutor of the ICC, Ms. Fatou Bensouda, will present its report on preliminary examination activities in 2017. So maybe it will be some important changes in relation to Ukraine, or some important, interesting ideas for us to look at and for us to discuss then. So the notion is that let's not forget about international humanitarian law. Let's apply international humanitarian law, and let's respect its rules and principles. So, very brief notion, maybe. And since it's almost 20 minutes we're late, let me then say a few words in order to close our today's discussion and conference. For the Institute of International Relations, it was a very important, very interesting event. We are very thankful to the Sovereign Order of Malta that came with this initiative to hold this conference. Again, all the values, all the common principles we share with the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and thus it's a great honor for us to hold this conference today together, to co-host it with the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And the Institute is very open and for a future cooperation possible. And we really are ready to become a venue, to become a platform for a further discussion. And you are always welcome guests in our Institute. So anytime, any day. And to all the audience in this hall, I hope it was an interesting conference for you. I really think that some notions were of such importance that we need to think of this. Dear students, please think of the ideas that were presented here, especially by the religious persons, by clergymen, because really they are of high moral value. And to finish up, maybe Your Excellency, if you want to say some words.
I take the occasion to the professors, the management, and I hope sincerely that this can be only the first step of a common path towards a better presence of the cultural world also in this situation, and to be useful to the development of this very important ancient country. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So we have finished our discussion. We'll meet in future, I think. Thank you very much. Питання, questions?
Question.
Okay, yes, sure. Да, будь ласка.
Я з української мови.
In Ukrainian.
Шановні брати і сестри,